12 Years in the Saddle for Law and Order on the Frontiers of Texas by Sergeant W. J. L. Sullivan, Texas Ranger. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please contact LibriVox.org. 12 Years in the Saddle, chapters 32 through 35. Chapter 32. My Experiences with a Bearskin Overcoat. When I went up to Eddy, New Mexico, to look for Jim Turner, I took with me my big bearskin overcoat, as the weather had turned very cold. My overcoat was a scary-looking thing, but I did not realize it when I first got it, so much as I did later on, after I had had a number of unusual experiences on its account. I was wearing the coat one morning while standing on one of the street corners in Eddy. I had my mind on something rather important to me then, and was not thinking about my coat, when suddenly a horse driven by a man and lady commenced shying at me and backing off as if it wanted to get as far away from me as possible. I was not enjoying the thought of anything being frightened at me, but suddenly remembering my coat, I got out of sight as quickly as possible. My movement did no good, however, for the horse kept up his rearing and pitching until he had turned the buggy over and damaged it in several places. The occupants of the buggy, fortunately, were not hurt, but I regretted the accident, and, feeling that I was the cause of it, I humbly begged their pardon, and then walked away, hoping that my coat would not get me into any more scrapes like this. After walking several blocks away from the scene of the first accident, I met a lady carrying a baby in her arms. Following her was her little boy of 5 years, with his large bulldog at his side. As soon as the dog spied me, he made a grab for my coat. He looked fierce, and I knew it wouldn't do to let him get the advantage of me, so I drew my six-shooter and placed the end of it in the brute's mouth. The woman screamed and asked me not to shoot the dog. I did not want to kill him unless I was forced to, but he struggled so hard to get to me that I had to keep the pistol in his mouth and walk backward. I told the woman if she would call the dog off I could get away without having to hurt it, but she was too excited to listen to my proposition and continued to plead for her dog's life. She said he was her only protection when her husband was gone, and that he was a good companion for her little boy. That might have been true, but she could not see any further than that, and could not realize that there was another side to the situation. I told her that the fact that the dog was valuable did not make it impossible for her to take him off me, and let me go on, but she did not look at it in that light, and I had to back down the street until I reached the courthouse steps before I could get rid of the brute. A woman and a dog following me down the street was quite an event to me, and all because of my overcoat. That was satisfactory to me so far as the lady was concerned, but I would rather not have a woman and a dog both to deal with at the same time. It wasn't long after that, however, until my overcoat caused a lady to run away from me. I was in Fort Worth, having just returned from Thurber, Texas, to which place I had taken $50,000 from Dallas so the miners could be paid off. Colonel Hunter, the president of the mines, had requested me to do this, as robberies had become quite numerous. It was still very cold, and I had on my bearskin overcoat. Early one morning, while riding on a streetcar, sitting in the corner next to the window, an old lady came in and sat down by me. She failed to see me at first, but when she did chance to look in my direction, she gave a scream that startled everybody on the car, and before anyone could reach her, she ran out of the door and jumped off. The conductor stopped the car and asked her what the trouble was. She replied that she did not want to ride with a bear. The conductor assured her that I was no bear, that I only had on a bearskin overcoat. She came back in and looked cautiously over her glasses at me, and giving another unearthly yell, she quickly fled and left the car again. The conductor tried to pacify her and told her that I was only a Texas Ranger wearing a bearskin overcoat, but she said, "I am satisfied that he is a bear. John told me when I left Tennessee that I had better be careful and watch out, for there were lots of strange things down in Texas, and you bet Mary is going to obey John." We went on then, and left Sister Mary standing by the side of the track, still obeying John. My overcoat was quite comfortable in cold weather, but I was getting tired of the trouble that it was constantly causing me. Still, I had hopes that it would get me into no more scrapes, and kept on wearing it that night. The next morning I put it on again, and as I left the hotel to go downtown, I passed a little girl who was about 9 or 10 years old, standing on the front gallery of her home. Upon seeing me, she called to her mother, telling her to come quick and see Santa Claus. While that experience was not so embarrassing as the others, it gave a hint that I was to always have trouble with my overcoat, so I made a solemn vow to sell it as soon as possible, for, on its account, many visions were haunting my mind. Among other things, there was the buggy and horse incident, the bulldog, the little girl and Santa Claus, and an old lady standing by the track, obeying John. Chapter 33. A Lively Chase. While generally successful in arresting noted criminals, although often after a long chase with a battle at the end of it, sometimes when the man sought for was almost within my grasp, he eluded capture. A case of this kind was my pursuit of two men who had held up a Fort Worth and Denver train 4 miles west of Childress County, Texas. In the latter part of 1894, while on the way from Amarillo to San Saba to appear in court against some cattle thieves whom I had arrested in San Saba County, the train which I was on met, at Bowie, a train on which was Walter Lyons, a cattle inspector, who asked me to meet him at Canadian City as soon as possible to assist him in arresting some cattle thieves. The next morning I heard, while in Fort Worth, that a train on the Fort Worth and Denver Railroad had been held up, but I could get no confirmation of the report. Upon arriving at San Saba, however, I found that the report was true. As soon as my business in court at San Saba was finished, I hurried to Childress to hunt for the robbers. In Wichita Falls, I saw City Marshal Charles Landers, of Vernon, who had come there on the same business that I came for, and also Bill Ish, ex-deputy marshal. They told me that in Vernon, the previous day, they had seen a stranger, riding and driving 3 horses, one of which was packed, and they had intended to investigate him, but he left sometime during the night, and they lost his trail. That they went to Wichita Falls the next morning, hoping to find him there. They also told me that they saw him from the car window as they were coming to Wichita Falls, and he was then driving only 2 horses. When they told me this, I proposed going back on the next train and riding until we met him, as he probably would not come to Wichita Falls. After some discussion, this plan was agreed to. When we boarded the train, the conductor gave me permission to pull a bell cord and stop the train if I saw the man. After going about 7 miles, I saw him and stopped the train, and George Thorne, the conductor, ran the train back as far as he could without placing the sleeper in danger if there should be a fight. My 2 men and I then got off and arrested him. Upon searching him, we found papers showing that he had been arrested at Harrell, and that he had been arrested for carrying a pistol, and had paid $22 in cash and left the missing horse as security for the balance of the fine. He gave his name as Farmer from Turkey Creek, Greer County, claiming to be on his way to Denton County after some horses he had there. I asked him why he had so many horses with him when he was going after more of them, and he replied that he did not want to ride the same one all the time. All this took some time, and the engineer kept ringing the bell and blowing the whistle to hurry us, as the train was late. Although satisfied that the prisoner had stolen the horses which he had, I was without proof, and not believing him to be implicated in the train robbery, I released him, and got back on the train and went to Iowa Park. Farmer had, apparently, told us a straight story, but I became suspicious after reaching Iowa Park, and Bill Ish and I got a buggy and went back and re-arrested him, searching him carefully, giving his papers a closer inspection, and questioned him fully as to himself and his movements. He stuck to his story of going to Denton County after horses, and although still suspicious, we were unable to make anything of him, and again released him, and returned to Iowa Park, where we spent the night at Scott Butler's hotel. I desired to be called in the morning in time for the westbound local, and, while sitting in the sitting room that morning, a stranger came in. He seemed to be chilled through, as though he had spent the night out of doors, and I asked him if he had camped out. He said no, that he had spent the night at the section house, a mile or so down the road. I asked him what he had done with his horse. "What horse?" he said. "The one you were riding," said I. "Well, that was a pony. I left him at Decatur 2 years ago with Ridley," he replied. "I am not talking about 2 years ago," said I. "I'm talking about the horse you rode to the railroad." "Oh, that horse. I sent him to Greer County." "And what did your partner do with his?" I asked. "He sent his also," he replied. I asked him if both horses were bays, and he said, "No, they are both gray." Upon asking him what he had done with his saddle and bridle, he said he had none, that he had ridden his horse bareback with a hackamore. This made me more suspicious than ever, and I asked him what his partner had done with his saddle and bridle. He said he had sold them to a man at the cement works 4 miles west of Kenna. In answer to my question, he said his name was John D. Hobart, and his partner's name was Bill Hughes, and he had known the latter for 11 years in Brown County. Further questions brought out the fact that he had separated from Hughes near the railroad dam, east of the flour mill in Cana, about 3 days previously. "When you left Bill," I asked, "where did you tell Bill to write to you?" "Well, I didn't tell him," said he. "Where did Bill tell you to write him?" "He didn't tell me." "Did you shake hands when you parted?" "No." "Why not? Had you quarreled?" "No, we were friends." "What, you had known each other 11 years, and you had parted without telling each other where to write and without even shaking hands, although you had had no quarrel?" "I will have to arrest you," I said. Breakfast was announced about this time, and Landers, Ish, and I, together with the prisoner, ate breakfast, and afterward boarded the train and went to Vernon, where Hobart was jailed. From Vernon, I wired to Captain J.V. Good, superintendent of the Fort Worth and Denver Railroad, to send the engineer and fireman of the train which was held up near Childress to identify the prisoner. They came, but were unable to swear positively that he was the robber, as his face was masked at the time of the holdup. They said, however, that his build, clothes, and hat corresponded to those of the robber, as also did his voice. I then took my prisoner to Childress and jailed him, leaving Ish and Landers at Vernon. When I arrested Hobart, I told him he was arrested for train robbery. He said that on the evening of the robbery he was digging a cellar for Pat Leonard, 20 miles south of Childress. After jailing Hobart at Childress, I went to Amarillo, telling him I would return in the morning and take him out to Leonard's to see if his story as to the cellar could be verified. On arriving at Childress the following morning, I was met by a deputy sheriff, who told me that Hobart's story was true, and that he had seen him dig in that cellar on the day he claimed, and that it would have been impossible for him to have reached the scene of the holdup at the time it took place. Acting upon this, I had Hobart released from jail, and gave him $5 and a ticket to Iowa Park. That was the last I ever saw of Hobart, although I tried afterward every way I could think of to find him. The robbery for which I had arrested Hobart was committed within a few miles of Childress, and the local officers had not succeeded in arresting the robber. So when I found too late that there was no truth in the story of either Hobart or the deputy sheriff as to Hobart having been at Pat Leonard's on the day of the robbery, I was compelled to believe that the deputy sheriff had secured his release through jealousy over the fact that the robber had been arrested by a ranger after the county officers had failed. When I released Hobart at Childress, I took the train and went to Amarillo, where I had to appear in court against 3 cow thieves, a Mr. Swen and his 2 sons. The next morning I went to the post office and found a letter to me from the jailer at Vernon. Inside of the envelope was another letter written by John Hobart to his uncle at Monktown, Fannin County, in which he made a full confession of the robbery. I succeeded in getting Judge Wallace and Judge Clemens and District Attorney D.B. Hill to release me that evening, for I showed them the letter and explained to them that I wanted to follow Hobart. The next morning I started to Decatur, and upon reaching there, I inquired at the livery stables to find out if Hobart had hired a horse at any time, but found that he had not done so. I found, though, that he had registered at one of the hotels as John D. Hobart, Honeygrove, Fannin County. I then boarded the train and went to Honeygrove. When I reached that place, I went to a merchant, in whom I could confide, and asked him if he knew anyone in the vicinity of Monktown by the name of George Hobart. He stated that he did, and that Monktown was 18 miles from there on the Red River, that George Hobart was running a big cotton gin at that place. I asked him if he knew of anyone at Monktown whom I could trust, and he told me that Deputy Sheriff White of that town was a trustworthy man. I went to Monktown that evening, and the next morning I hunted up Mr. White and explained the case to him, and after describing Hobart to him, I asked White to go out to George Hobart's and see if John Hobart was there. I also told him that if he failed to find him, to tell his uncle, George Hobart, that he had met his nephew 3 months ago at Decatur, and had been informed by him that there was a man there who had some horses and mules for sale, and that he wanted to know the name of the man with whom his nephew lived in Decatur, so that he could find him and get some information from him in regard to the party who had the horses and mules to sell. White immediately went out to George Hobart's place and saw him, but failed to find the man whom we wanted. He returned, however, with the information that John Hobart lived 9 miles from Decatur with a man by the name of John Ridley. I went to Fort Worth and wired Sheriff Moore at Decatur, asking him if he knew a man by the name of John Ridley in that country, and if he did, to meet me at the depot on the arrival of the next train from Fort Worth, with horses and saddles for us both. He answered that there were 2 brothers, Jim and John Ridley, living 9 miles from Decatur, so when I arrived at that town, Moore was waiting for me with horses and saddles. We left at once for Ridley's, and, on the way there, Moore informed me that he had a friend who lived between the 2 Ridley brothers, and that we had better see his friend first, as we might obtain some information from him. We called by and saw this man, who informed us that he had been at Jim Ridley's the evening before, and at John Ridley's that morning, and that he had not seen anyone who fitted the description of John Hobart. He said, however, that he did see such a person in Decatur the Friday before, with John Ridley and his wife. After we left this man, I suggested to Moore that I go to Ridley's and spend the night, and tell them I was hunting land to rent, but he would not agree to that. We decided to return to Decatur then, for as court was in session at Decatur, Sheriff Moore had to be there. The next morning I went to John Ridley's, and when I knocked, a lady came to the door and informed me that she was Mrs. Ridley. "Is your husband here?" I asked. "No, sir," she replied. "If you came from town, you met him not far back." "I did meet a man about 2 miles back," I answered, "and I suppose he was your husband." I then told her I lived on Denton Creek, where I was feeding 2,000 beeves. "I heard in Decatur," I continued, "that there was a young man with you and your husband last Friday, and that he wanted to hire to you, but the party who told me didn't know whether you hired him or not, and if you did, he said he didn't think you needed him, and that as I am needing help very badly and giving attention to my cattle, I would like to hire him, if he's here and you do not need him." "That was John Hobart," she replied, "but you would not want him on your place, as he is such a vulgar man." "No, I don't want him," I replied, "if he is a tough character, for I have a wife and 4 grown daughters." "He is a right tough character," she said. "But in case I am forced to have him," I said, "where do you think I could likely find him?" "Well, I expect you'll find him at his grandfather's, who lives on Emerson's Prairie, 18 miles from Paris. His grandfather is named Saul Hildeman. John Hobart has 150 acres of land at his grandfather's, and he is probably there attending to it." In the letter which John Hobart wrote to his uncle, which was sent to me by the jailer at Vernon, and which he confessed to the robbery, he stated to his uncle that he supposed this jail business would make his cake all dough with his girl. So I asked Mrs. Ridley if he had a girl, and she replied that he did, that her name was Emma Kitchens, and that she lived on Emerson's Prairie. After gaining this information, I returned to Decatur and went to Paris, hired a buggy and team, and went out to Emerson's store, where I learned the way to Mr. Hydeman's. When I reached there, I introduced myself to him under another name, and stated to him that I was renting land south of Paris, but that I had accumulated enough money to buy me a home, that I met his grandson about 3 months ago, and he told me he had some land in this part of the country, and that I had come out to see about buying it. The old gentleman showed me the land, and stated he would be glad if his grandson would sell it and settle down with his father, near Brownwood. Returning to Paris, I left at once for Brownwood, and upon arriving there, the deputy sheriff and I went to Mr. Hobart's, 20 miles from Brownwood. Mrs. Hobart informed me that her husband was 2.5 miles from there, helping a neighbor kill hogs. When we arrived at this place, the deputy sheriff introduced me to someone as Jones, and just then a man stepped up and said, "Hello, Sullivan." I had my mustache and beard blacked, in order to avoid detection by those who might know me, but this fellow seemed to recognize me after all. "You must be mistaken in my name," I said, "for my name is Jones." "You used to guard the jail in Mangum, in Greer County," he replied, "against a mob that wanted to hang Race Thomas and Jeff Adams for murder." I told him he was mistaken in my name, and asked, "Where is Mangum?" "It is 55 miles north of Canna, in Greer County," he replied. "What road is Canna on?" I asked. "On the Fort Worth and Denver." "I have never been any further north than Fort Worth," I replied. He gave it up, and said he supposed he was mistaken. It was now dinner time, and we all went in and took our places around the table. Tom Hobart, being a visitor, the host asked him to return thanks. He did so, and from the length of the blessing and the way he asked it, I imagined that he was a Methodist. When he had finished, I said, "Gentlemen, we ought always to be thankful for the luxuries of life that we receive, but, as a general thing, we are not half as thankful as we should be." "Are you a member of the church?" asked Hobart. "Yes, sir, I am." "To what church do you belong?" "To the Methodist," I replied. "Give me your hand," he replied. "I am a Methodist, too." After dinner, I told the old gentleman I had met his son, and he told me about having some land on Emerson's Prairie, that I had gone there and looked at the land, and was well pleased with it, and had about decided to quit renting land and buy me a place, and that I had come to Brown County to see about buying the land. He suggested that the deputy sheriff and I get in the buggy and go with him to the house and examine the papers. This we did. He got the deeds out of a trunk and handed them to me. I examined them very carefully, one by one. I could not have told whether they were right or wrong if my life had depended on it. I told him I couldn't see anything wrong with them. I asked where I could likely find his son, and he replied that he didn't know where he was, but that he would be glad for him to sell the place and settle down close to him, as he was a very wild boy. This boy's father, Tom Hobart, was a commissioner and deputy sheriff of Brown County. After the deputy sheriff and I left the house, he turned to me and said, "I have placed myself in a pretty shape by introducing you as Sam Jones to the old gentleman, for he will undoubtedly find out that this is all a fake about you buying land, and he will have it in for me." "What kind of a man is he? Is he a good man?" "As good a man as ever lived," he replied. "Well, suppose we go back and tell him the truth about the matter, and lay the case before him, and show him the letter written by his son to the boy's uncle, in which he confessed to the robbery. Do you think he would rather aid us in finding the boy than to have him still run at large, and probably be killed some day while robbing some bank or express car? Or, if not killed, sent to the penitentiary for life?" "I believe he would rather help us to find him," replied the deputy. We concluded, therefore, to go back, and I told him my real name and why I was there. He turned pale and commenced trembling, and told me he thought there was something strange about the affair when I was talking to him about buying the land. I explained to him what would probably be the fate of his son if he should run at large, and that I thought it would be better for him and better for the boy if his lawlessness should be checked. The old gentleman agreed with me, and said that while he had no idea where the boy was at that time, he would aid me in every way in locating him. I failed to find young Hobart, although I made every effort to do so. I have seen the deputy sheriff of Brown County several times, and he informs me that Tom Hobart has never heard of his boy from the time I was in Brown County looking for him. Later on I caught Hobart's partner, Bill Hughes, 30 miles below Canna, but, John Hobart being at large, Hughes could not be convicted. Chapter 34. Battle in the Dugout. I left Vernon on the 24th of December, 1896, with Sheriff Sanders of Wilbarger County and Bill Ish to hunt for a train robber. We expected to locate him and another man, Tom Wright, whom we also wanted, at a dance that was to be given that night on Beaver Creek, 20 miles below Vernon. Wright was at the dance, as we had expected, but he made his escape before we got there. After leaving the dance, we went to an old gentleman's house, about 2 miles away, to spend the night, arriving there about 1:30 in the morning. We were quite hungry, as we had had no dinner or supper, so the lady brought out some cakes and pies, it being Christmas, and set them before us. They were delicious, and we ate a whole lot before we were through. The next morning the family, which consisted of the man and his wife and their 6 grown children, 3 sons and 3 daughters, gathered together to have prayer. Of course, we 3 men were there too. The old gentleman read a chapter of the Bible, and then called on Bill Ish to pray. Bill balked. He then called on Sheriff Sanders to pray, but the latter gentleman also failed to respond. I had already made up my mind that if he called on me, I was going to pray entirely for Bill and Dick Sanders, but for some reason I was not called upon. After spending a part of the day in that part of the country, we returned to Vernon, where I learned that there was a telegram for me at the depot. The message was from Taylor Holt, the bookkeeper at Wagoner's store, and stated that 4 men had come to the store and beat one of the clerks nearly to death, and that they needed my assistance. I took Jack Harrell, a daring ranger, and we caught the train at once for Wagner. When we arrived at Wagner, Taylor Holt was at the train to meet us, and took us over to the store, where he described the 4 desperadoes. When he expressed the opinion that the 4 men were still in the country, I said that we had better sleep in the store, as I thought the men would attempt to rob the store that night. There was a bed in the store, and as I was tired, not having slept much in 2 days and nights, I lay down at once to go to sleep, after telling Holt to rouse me if he heard anyone, and I was not the first to wake up. About 10 o'clock, someone called at the front door of the store, and Holt and I awoke about the same time. Holt answered the call and told the party he was coming. I buckled on my 6-shooter, picked up my Winchester, and went down the aisle in the store to where I struck the opening between 2 counters. I hid behind a showcase and told Holt that when he got to the door to ask who it was, and if he found it was the robbers, for him to drop flat on the floor behind the door after he opened it, and as they stepped in, I would do the work for them. But when he asked who it was that they wanted, the party answered, "I am Alf Bailey. I was robbed a while ago by 4 men. We let him in, and Holt introduced us. Bailey said he was told that I was staying in Wagoner's store that night, and he had come to ask me to aid him in finding the robbers. Bailey's store was 4 miles south of Wagoner's store, and instead of robbing Wagoner's store as we expected they would, the desperadoes robbed Alf Bailey's store and the post office, which was in the same building, getting about $700 worth of merchandise and all the money and stamps in the post office. Judging from Bailey's description of the men, I thought I knew one of them. I asked Holt if he had any horses we could use, and he replied that all of the horses were out in the pasture. It was about as cold a night, to be no wind blowing, as I ever saw in the Panhandle, so I told Bailey that as we had no horses, it would be better for him to go back home and meet me in the morning with the trail. Bailey said he thought the 4 men went toward the Indian Territory. I notified all the officers up and down the line of the robbery, so they would be on the lookout for the robbers. I also wired the boys at headquarters to come down. The next morning, Taylor Holt, Alf Bailey, and some others and I started out over the trail. The ground was frozen so hard that only one of the 4 horses made an impression on it, he weighing about 1,200 pounds. After we had traveled some distance, we came to a small house where the 4 men had spent the balance of the night. There were signs where they had fed the horses and had cooked, eaten, and slept. We also found a number of fine quirts between the mattresses, some tobacco, and about 50 pounds of coffee in a shed room, which had been taken from Bailey's store. There was no one on the place but a big bulldog tied to the front door, and we had to enter the house through a window. Finding no one around anywhere, Taylor Holt and I went to the nearest house to see if we could get any information about the robbers. When we got to the house, Holt went around to the back door while I knocked on the front door. I had to knock 4 or 5 times before I received an answer, and it was a lady who finally opened the door. About the same time, I heard Holt speak to someone in the backyard. I hurried around there and arrested a man who was just coming out of the back door. He was the owner of the house where the 4 desperados had stayed the night before. I asked him a few questions in regard to where he had stayed the night before and who had stayed at his house, but I could get no information from him. I then asked him about the quirts, tobacco, and coffee at his house, and he said he knew nothing about them. I thought it best to hold him for a while, so Holt and I took him to the railroad, where we met a local. We hid our horses, boarded the local, went to Iowa Park, and met the northbound passenger train. We then turned our prisoner over to an officer, Eugene Logan, with instructions to jail him at Vernon, and then we quit the train where we had left our horses. The night was so dark that we lost our way, and, after riding nearly all night, finally found ourselves at the house of a Mr. Cobbs, the place where I arrested the man the day before. Mr. Cobbs fed our horses for us, and I took time to sleep a little, after asking Mr. Cobbs to let us have breakfast as soon as they could get it ready, it then being about 4 o'clock in the morning. After breakfast, Mr. Cobbs told me that the man I arrested there the day before had taken his Cobb's hat and left his own new Stetson hat. I took possession of this new Stetson hat and found that it had Mr. Bailey's cost mark in it. Holt and I then returned to Wagner, where we met the men whom we were with the day before. We also found there Sheriff Moses and Constable Tom Pickett from Wichita Falls, Bud Hardin, a special ranger from Harrell, Dick Sanders, Sheriff of Wilbarger County, Johnny Williams, Deputy Sheriff of Wilbarger County, Charlie Landers, City Marshal of Vernon, Jack Harville, Bob McClure, Billy McCauley, and Lee Queen, Rangers, and Alf Bailey. I wired Sheriff Tittle of Mangum, Greer County, 55 miles off the railroad, about the robbery. My men and I left at once for Wagner's headquarters camp on Red River, where I got horses for the men, and where I received some information in regard to the 4 outlaws. We traveled on toward the Indian Territory, and just before crossing Red River I met a man by the name of Dick Farrell, who was Tom Wagner's line camp rider, and who lived in the Indian Territory, 20 miles from Red River. I asked him if there was anyone at the line camp when he left, and he replied that there was no one there. I then asked him if he had seen anyone since he left the line camp, and he replied that he had seen 2 objects, but they were such a long distance off that he couldn't tell whether they were horses, cattle, or men, and that he couldn't tell whether they were moving or standing still. He told me he had plenty to eat and lots of horse feed at the camp, but had only 1 bed. So we pushed on. About an hour before sundown, a big blue norther blew up, which we had to face. Just at dusk we came in sight of Dick Farrell's camp, which was a dugout, half rock and half dirt, built in the head of a draw, and there was a bright light shining out of the mouth of the dugout down the draw. 6 of my men had fallen behind, so I told the other 5 that those fellows in the dugout were either the outlaws or some hunters, and that we had better wait for the other men. We waited for some time, but they failed to come, and I told my men we would try it without the others. We started toward the dugout in a gallop, getting a little faster all the time, and when we got within 75 yards of the dugout, the 4 desperados, Joe Beckham, Hill Loftos, Red Buck, and the Kid, Elmore Lewis, ran out and opened fire on us, killing 3 horses. I was making every effort to get my Winchester out of the scabbard, with all 4 of the outlaws shooting at us, but my horse was rearing and plunging so much to get away from the flare of the guns that every time I would reach down to pull my gun out, he would rear, and the horn of my saddle would knock me away from it. But after 3 trials, and after getting a rib broken, I succeeded in getting my gun, when I fell off my horse and faced the 4 men. 3 of them were in a trench leading into the dugout, and the 4th, Redbuck, was standing in the door of the dugout. I opened fire on them, as they were already shooting at us, and my first shot struck Redbuck just over the heart, and he fell backward into the dugout. The ball had only struck his breastplate, however, and he fainted, but recovered in a few minutes and again joined in the fight. I found out afterward that we hit him again, shattering his collarbone and shoulder blade. I also learned that one of the men in the trench was killed. The firing was kept up until we had emptied our Winchesters and reloaded them. Suddenly I heard a gunshot behind me, and I turned and discovered that Johnny Williams, the deputy sheriff of Wilbarger County, had come to my assistance. His horse had been killed in the fight, and Johnny returned to me at once. I asked Johnny if he was hurt, and he replied that he was not, but added that I had better lie down on the ground or the desperadoes would kill me. Out of all the officers, Johnny was the stayer. We fired several more shots at the 3 men, but they went into the dugout and fired at us from a window. I suggested to Johnny that we dismount the 4 men by killing their horses, which we did, and every time we fired a horse fell. There were 4 animals in the pen, but it was so dark we couldn't see very well, and we afterward found that we had killed 2 of Wagner's horses, which they had stolen, and 2 of his big freight mules, which were used by Farrell. They had stolen 2 other horses from an old fellow in the Cheyenne country, but they had turned them out into the pasture. Later we captured these 2 horses and turned them over to their owner. I suggested to Johnny that we crawl across the draw and get in the corral, behind those dead horses, and kill the men as they came to the door. We then started crawling across the draw, keeping as close to the ground as we possibly could, when the men suddenly began firing on us again. Just at this time I fell over backward into a gully, and got fastened so tight that I had to make several efforts before I could get out. I was asking Johnny all the time if he was hurt, and he crawled over to the edge of the gully that I was in, and said he was not injured at all. I whispered to Johnny that I had to get out of that gully, and if they killed me when I raised myself out of it, for him to shoot at the blaze and kill the man who shot me. I managed to get out of the gully, however, without being shot, and we began crawling again towards the corral, which was then about 20 steps away, and if we could get behind the dead horses, we would only be about 15 steps from the door of the dugout. We had gotten on high ground when the 3 men skylighted us and opened fire again. Johnny asked what we had better do, and I replied that it would not hurt to crawfish a little at that particular time, and we turned back, when we met 3 of the other men whom we left. We fought the outlaws until 11 o'clock that night. Every time they saw any of us moving anywhere, they fired at us, and we fired back at them. Finally, we got so cold we couldn't pull a cartridge from our belts, and couldn't work the lever of our Winchesters, and we had to quit. We decided to go back that night to Wagner's camp, which was 25 miles away. So we started out, walking across the country. We arrived at Wagner's camp the next morning, and I gave Dick Farrell $5 to guide me back across the country to the dugout. All of my men, except Billy McCauley and Lee Queen, refused to go back with me. So with these 2 men and Dick Farrell, I left for the dugout in a blinding storm of snow and sleet. When we arrived at Red River, Dick Farrell decided that he didn't care to go to the dugout if we went together, for if the men were still there, they would open fire on us as they did the night before. He suggested that he go alone, and, if they were there, to tell them he was the owner of the dugout and that he would report to me that night. I concluded to let him do this. Farrell then went to the dugout, and my men and I returned to Wagner's ranch. That evening Farrell returned to the ranch and stated that the desperadoes had left the dugout, but he found Sheriff Tittle of Greer County there with John Byers and Jim Ferris, 2 of his deputies. Tittle told Farrell there had been a fight there the night before, and 1 man killed, and he asked Farrell if he knew who had been in the fight. Farrell told him it was Sullivan and his officers and the 4 outlaws. He then instructed Farrell to return to Wagner's ranch and tell me that he and his men had come to the dugout to investigate the matter, and that Joe Beckham, ex-sheriff of Motley County, had been killed the night before, and that there had been 7 horses killed, and for me to come there at once, and he would stay until I arrived. Farrell returned to me with this information, and I immediately got a buckboard and a pair of mules from Tom Wagner, and, with Alf Bailey, Billy McCauley, and Lee Queen, went to the dugout, where I found Sheriff Tittle and his 2 men. Before we entered the dugout, where Alf Bailey's goods were, we had him tell us his cost mark. We examined the goods, the cost mark on them tallied with the cost mark Bailey had given us before seeing the goods, and we recovered nearly all of the merchandise that had been stolen from Bailey. I put Beckham's body in the buckboard, and then loaded in 7 saddles, 3 of which we took off the dead horses, and 4 which belonged to the 4 outlaws. I also put in Alf Bailey's goods, and then returned to Wagner Station on the Fort Worth and Denver Railroad. The next day, Tuesday, we buried Beckham, but the following Thursday I received orders from Adjutant General Mabry to hold an inquest over Beckham's body, and we had to take the body up and hold an inquest over it that day. Before burying him again, however, I took his wife's ring off his finger. Beckham had a sister living in Altus, and one night while I was in that town she sent for me to ask me about her brother. I went to see her, and gave her the ring which I had taken from her brother's finger. I explained to her the manner in which her brother had met his death, and, although terribly grieved, she said she could not hold me responsible for his sad fate. She said her brother had once been an honorable man, but had gradually gotten bad, and kept getting worse, until his untimely and tragic end was inevitable. Chapter 35. An Exciting Experience with Indians. After the battle in the dugout, I returned to Amarillo, and 9 days later I received a message from the operator at Wagner, and one from Taylor Holt also, saying that there was a man in Paint Creek dugout by the name of Red Buck, and that he was very badly wounded and expected to die, and that his friends were making arrangements to carry him further off. At that time all of my ranger boys were out on a scouting expedition, so I sent to Vernon for the deputy marshal, and wired C. Madsen of El Reno, chief of the marshals, to send me one of his deputies, and he sent me Ed Myers. I also had Jailer Shies of Vernon, Tom Piggott, constable of Wichita Falls, Sam Abbott of Wichita Falls, Charlie Landers, city marshal of Vernon, and Henry McCauley of Wichita Falls. With these men I went to S.B. Burnett's headquarters camp, 10 miles from Wichita Falls, where I succeeded in getting a wagon and a span of mules, and horses for myself and men, and plenty of bacon, beef, coffee, flour, and horse feed. We then started out, with Henry McCauley as teamster. That night we camped at Burnett's line camp in the Territory. Before we reached this place, however, we had quite a lively scene. There were 2 Negroes and an old white man at the line camp. They saw us when we were several hundred yards away, and thought we were outlaws, and the 2 Negroes, one with a 6-shooter and the other with a Winchester, were trying to get to a thicket about 200 yards from the camp. The old white man was standing on the gallery, trying to get the Negroes to stay there, and he finally succeeded, after they had jumped the fence 3 or 4 times. When we reached the camp, the 2 Negroes, Zip and Jack, told us they thought we were Foster Crawford's gang. The white man had taken out a little notebook before we reached the camp, and had written in it, "I was killed by outlaws." I told him he made his will too quick. Zip was scared so badly that his face was a creamy color, although he was naturally as black as the ace of spades. I asked him if he had been powdering his face, as it looked nearly white, and he replied that he was so badly frightened that he didn't know whether his face would ever resume its original color or not. Things quieted down, and old Zip, being also badly scared, cooked us a fine supper that night. As I was not very well acquainted with that section of the country, the next morning I concluded it would be better to have someone to go with us who was familiar with the country, so I got Jack to go in front of us, and I told him that whenever he came near a dugout he must go ahead and see if everything was all right, and then report to me, as I did not want to rush myself and the boys into anything without first knowing a few particulars. Jack located several dugouts, and came back and reported each time that there were no strangers or wounded men in any of them. About 11 o'clock that day, Jack had gotten careless and had fallen behind with the teamster. Ed Myers and I were riding in the lead. While looking ahead of us I saw a little box house about 800 yards away, and a moment later I beheld 3 people running out of it, 2 at the back of the house and 1 in the front. I motioned to the men to come on, and Jack ran his horse up beside me, and I asked him who lived in the house. He replied that a family of white people lived there. We ran our horses toward the house, and after we had run about 500 yards, Jack said he saw a buggy leave the house, but as neither Myers nor I had seen this buggy, we rode straight for the house, while Jack kept leaning to the left, away from the house. Myers and I ran up to the back of the house, and there we found a buggy, but there was no team hitched to it. I remarked to Myers, "Look where Jack is, he sees something," and we ran our horses toward Jack. After we had gone about 500 yards, we discovered this buggy coming around a hill, and they were riding around to get on our left. So I told Myers to kill their horses, and as he was riding next to them, and my Winchester was a long one and hard to handle on horseback. After Myers fired, they began firing on us, and I told him to quit shooting and wait until they started down a string of wire fence, and we would then follow them. When we get close enough to them, I will get off my horse and tear the back out of the buggy, I said. Just as I was about to dismount, Jack threw his hat in the air and yelled, "Comanches!" We then saw an Indian, whose name I afterward learned was Crowmore, come out of Oak Creek riding a paint pony, and he fired 2 shots at us with his Winchester, yelling, "Sheep shear," meaning hurry up. About this time we discovered that the people in the buggy whom we were after were Indians, 3 of whom were Crowmore's wife and Papoose and his brother-in-law. Crowmore and the 3 other Indians in the buggy then went down to their camp. Jailer Shies proposed going to the camp and explaining things, as he was acquainted with Crowmore, but I advised him to stay away, as Crowmore would not know him from any other officer if he saw him riding up to his camp, and as he was on the warpath, he might shoot him. Shies insisted, however, and I told him if he would go that he had better go alone, for if several of us went, Crowmore would likely fire on us before we could get him located. Shies decided to go alone, and after he had been gone some time, I began to feel uneasy about him, so I took Sam Abbott, Ed Myers, and Jack and went down to the camp to see what the trouble was. I found no one there, but while searching for Shies, I found a rope stretched in the yard loaded with what I took to be beef. I dismounted and ate a big lot of Crowmore's nice beef, and then got my men and went back to the little house which we had left some time before. There I found the other members of my party, and they were just getting ready for dinner. I told them that I had eaten so much good beef that I was not hungry and did not want any dinner. "Where did you get the beef?" the lady of the house asked me. "Down at Crowmore's camp," I replied. "Well, that beef you ate down there was an old horse that died a few days ago, and they jerked him on that rope," she said. "Well, he was jerked twice then if they jerked him, for I jerked him once myself," I answered. I did not say anything else, but my meat didn't sit very well after that. About 15 minutes after I arrived at this house, and while watching for Shies, I saw 46 Indians riding toward the house as fast as their horses could carry them. When the lady, who lived at the house where we were, saw them, she said that they were on the warpath, for she had lived in that section of the country 15 years and knew their ways. The Indians came within 500 yards of where we were, and with their horses formed a figure 8. Jack said that that was a sign they were going to fight us, and when they made 3 such figures, it meant they were coming. They went back a short distance, and then came toward us and made another figure 8, leaving them 1 more to make before they charged us. I then discovered 2 Indians running their horses toward the haystacks back of the house. I saw at once that if they reached the haystacks, they would have the advantage of us, so I sent Charlie Landers and Sam Abbott to head them off, and after a quick chase, they beat the Indians to the stacks, and the Indians returned and joined the others, who were getting ready to make the 3rd figure 8. This lady, whom I have spoken of several times, informed me that she could speak the Indian language as well as they could, and offered to go to the Indians and deliver any message I might wish to send them. I accepted her proposition, and asked her to tell them that we were Texas Rangers and we had a deputy marshal from El Reno with us, that we had come to this house to look for a wounded man by the name of Red Buck, that we heard they were going to take him away in a buggy, that when we saw the buggy leave the house so hurriedly, we concluded the man we wanted was in the buggy, and consequently had tried to kill the horses which were hitched to the buggy, not knowing we were after Crowmore's people. After I explained to the lady what to tell the Indians, she started toward them, swinging her blue bonnet in the air to let them know she wished to speak to them. She explained the situation to them, but they told her we had deceived her, and also told her they knew we were outlaws, as they had been informed at Fort Sill that the country was full of them, and that there had been a fight about 25 miles below there a few nights back, and they were satisfied we had come to kill their people. She returned and reported what they had told her. I then asked her to go to them and state to them that Tom Pickett, constable from Wichita Falls, was with our men, and that they ought to know him, as he had managed their war dances for them at Wichita Falls, and that he could prove to them that we were officers. She did this, and informed us that the Indians said to send Tom Pickett to them. Tom didn't seem to be very anxious to make the visit to the Indians just then, but I told him to lay his Winchester down on the ground where they could see it, and to go to them and try to make a treaty with them, and that if they killed him, I would kill every one of them before they could get back to Fort Sill. Tom concluded to go, and Henry McCauley, the teamster, volunteered to go with them. When they reached the Indians, they recognized Tom at once, and the chief dismounted and took Tom and Henry by the hands, and seemed to be very glad to find out that they were not outlaws. He instructed his warriors to stay where they were, while he investigated the matter a little more. He mounted his horse and came toward us at full speed, and when he arrived within 70 yards of us, he threw his Winchester across his left wrist. This was a sign that we were friends, but I didn't know it at the time, and I came very near shooting him, but Jack stopped me and explained what was meant by it. When he reached us, he dismounted, shook hands with us all, and then motioned for his men to come, and they, with Tom and Henry, soon joined us. I cautioned the men not to let the Indians get to our guns, and not to be too free with them. The Indians would point to our belts and indicate to us that they wanted us to give them some cartridges, which we did. The chief informed me that Cromore's wife had gone to Fort Sill, where she would report that we were outlaws, and that the police and soldiers would be looking for us in a short while, and we had better hire 2 of his men to stay with us the balance of that day and that night, in order to assist us in explaining our presence in the country, and that if I would give him $5, he would let me have 2 of his men. I told him I would give him $2.50, but he would not consent to take less than $5, so we agreed upon that amount. All this conversation was carried on, of course, with the help of the lady who was with us. When I first saw that the Indians were convinced that we were not outlaws, I had told the lady to ask them if they had seen anything of a white man, for I was uneasy about Shies, not having seen him since he went to Cromore's camp, but the Indians replied that they had not seen anyone at all. A few minutes later Shies rode up and said that he had just been riding around the country scouting. And chapters 32 through 35. 12 Years in the Saddle for Law and Order on the Frontiers of Texas by Sergeant W. J. L. Sullivan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please contact LibriVox.org. 12 Years in the Saddle, chapters 36 through 42. Chapter 36. The Arrest of Jerome Loftus. While in Vernon helping to hold court in the trial of Joe Blake, who was alleged to have killed Sheriff Tom McGee in Hemphill County, I received a warrant from Bowie County for the arrest of Jerome Loftus, who was wanted for stabbing a man in New Boston 10 years before that. I did not know that Loftus was in Vernon until Mrs. Aiken, the proprietress of the hotel, told me that a man by the name of Jerome Loftus was in the hotel the night before to see me. I asked Mrs. Aiken when the man would be back, and she replied, in a day or 2. I told Mrs. Aiken that I would be glad to see Jerome, as I had not seen him but once, and that was a few days after the fight which I had had with his brother, Hill Loftus, in the dugout in the Comanche Strip. I began watching for Loftus, and the second morning after the lady told me that he was in town, I went into the gentleman's sitting room and found him standing by the stove. I did not recognize him, however, until after he had spoken to me and told me his name. When he told me that he was Jerome Loftus, I merely asked him if he had eaten his breakfast, and he replied that he had not. The first table was full, so I told him that we would watch our chance and eat at the next table. When we went to the table, I let him sit on my right side, and I made it a point to get through eating before he did. Leaving the table after breakfast, we went into the gentleman's sitting room, where I found about 25 men standing around. I did not want to arrest Loftus in the presence of these people, and, noticing that the stove in the ladies' sitting room was heated up, I said to Loftus, "Let's go in yonder, where there is a good fire." After we got in the room, I told Loftus that I had a warrant for him. "Where from?" he asked. "From New Boston," I replied. I searched him then, but found nothing but a pocket knife. I told him that I did not want to handcuff him, nor put him in jail, that for his sake I didn't want people to know that he was under arrest. I then notified the sheriff of New Boston that I had his man, but it was 3 days before he came to Vernon after him. I never jailed Loftus, though, nor put handcuffs on him, but I kept him in my sight all the time. I told Loftus to go with me when I took Joe Blake to the trial, and for him to sit near Blake, the defendant, so I could watch both of them at the same time. When the sheriff came after him, I told him that Loftus had behaved well, and that he deserved the good treatment which he had received at my hands. I told the sheriff that I would appreciate it if he would also treat him as courteously as the circumstances justified, as Loftus had been a good citizen ever since he stabbed the man 10 years before, and that he had been a good prisoner. Just as the train was pulling in, Loftus asked me to let him speak to me. We walked a few steps away from the sheriff, and I told him that I was ready to listen to him. He asked me if I knew what he thought of me, and I told him that I did not. "I think you have been giving me dirt ever since you arrested me," he replied. I immediately turned Loftus over to the sheriff, telling the latter that he had better handcuff and shackle him securely, as I had learned that I was greatly deceived in the prisoner when I recommended him so highly a few minutes before. I told Loftus that I was mighty glad he let me know what he thought of me before it was too late for me to do him any service. The sheriff did as I told him, and securely shackled and handcuffed Loftus, much to the latter's displeasure. Loftus stood his trial in New Boston and came clear. A year later I met him on a Fort Worth and Denver train while I was going to Fort Worth. I was talking to a lady when Loftus came through the car and greeted me and told me that he wanted to see me in the smoker. I told him all right. He then turned and went back into the smoker. "Who is that gentleman?" the lady asked. I told her that he was Jerome Loftus and that I had once arrested him in Vernon. I also told her what Loftus said to me when the train rolled into Kenna, and, I added, that he might want to call my hand for telling the sheriff to handcuff and shackle him. "You ought not to go into the smoker if you think there will be trouble," she replied. I told her that I would go anyway, but when I entered the smoking car, Loftus got up and introduced me to 4 or 5 men and treated me as cordially as he knew how. He motioned me to a vacant seat, and later on apologized to me for what he had said to me before he boarded the train in Kenna. "You treated me so nice when you had me in your charge," he said, "that I have been sorry ever since then that I told you that you had been giving me dirt, for I knew at the time that you had not." "What prompted you to make such a remark, then?" I asked. "I was mad at the world in general," he replied, "for I had led a better life ever since I cut the man in New Boston, and had worked hard on the ranches, and had saved my earnings and accumulated a little bunch of cattle. I had gotten a little start in life, and felt happy, but when you arrested me I realized that it was all up with me then, and knew I would have to spend everything I had to come clear. I was reckless, and never thought about what I said to you, but I am ashamed of it now, and hope you will forgive me and forget that incident." I told him that I had already forgiven him, and we were good friends ever after. Chapter 37. The Capture and Trial of Swin. In 1896, the citizens around Amarillo were constantly losing their fat cattle, and could not locate the cause, and I was informed by John Curry, who lived in the north edge of town, that he suspected Old Man Crump and his 2 sons, Albert and Bill, who lived 2 miles north of town, who were running a butcher shop in Amarillo. Albert Crump lived in town and did the selling of the beef. After learning all of this from John Curry, I decided to lie around Crump's place and try to catch him and his 2 boys in case they were stealing cattle. I watched the old man's place for quite a while. One evening Sam Dunn and Hank Siders, both cattle inspectors, and I waylaid Crump's pasture, and a little before dark we heard a gunshot at his slaughterhouse. We waited about half an hour in order to give him time to get his beef skinned, but we stayed a little too long. Billy, his son, about 22 years of age, took the beef to the city and placed it in the butcher shop. I followed the hack and got there in time to stand out in the dark and see Billy carve the beef. The quarters of this beef looked to me, from a distance, to be about a 2 or 3 year old animal. I could see them from the light he had in his butcher shop. I said nothing to Bill, not even letting him know that I was in town. Hank and Sam and I went back to Old Man Crump's. It must have been about 10 o'clock at night. I called out at the gate and learned that Old Man Crump had gone to bed. He got up, however, and came about halfway from the house to the gate and asked me who I was. I told him that it was Sullivan. He told me to wait a minute until he went into the house to put on his shoes, as he was barefooted. I waited, although I believed that he was trying to make medicine or work his rabbit foot on me. When he got to the door, I saw his wife slipping out to the west gate in a stooped position, making her way to the slaughterhouse. I told her to come back and not go about the slaughterhouse. She obeyed my command. Then I asked the old man if he had killed a beef that evening. He said that he had. I told him that I wanted to see the hide. He said that it was in the slaughterhouse. We 3 dismounted and went to the slaughterhouse, and came very nearly being taken in by the worst set of dogs I ever saw. He must have had 8 or 10 vicious dogs. I think he kept those dogs on hand to bluff people so they would not come anywhere about his place. When we arrived at the slaughterhouse, he pulled a hide out of a barrel of brine and threw it on the floor, with the hair side up. It being wet, it rattled as if it were a green hide. This hide must have been 7 or 8 days old. It was so dark in the slaughterhouse that I could not tell whether this was a fresh hide or an old one. I rubbed my hand over the hide and got the scent of it, and told the boys that the hide was an old one. I struck a match, and, as the slaughterhouse was open at the top, the wind would blow my matches out as fast as I could strike them. At last I told Mrs. Crump to go into the house and bring me a lamp or a lantern. She remarked that the wind would blow the lamp or lantern, either one, out, and that we had better take the hide into the house. So I told the old man to take hold of one end of the hide and Hank the other. When we got into the house and threw the hide on the floor, I discovered that it was black, and that it was an old one with a brand on it. The old man asked me to let him step out of doors. I granted him this privilege, knowing that he was going to the slaughterhouse. The old man went directly to the slaughterhouse, and I went directly to the same place. When I reached the place, I heard him drop the hide in this barrel of brine. Then he picked up a zinc tub to put over the barrel, and, as he did so, I arrested him. We left at once for town. After turning him over to Hank and Sam, I went to meet Billy to arrest him and to keep him away from his father, so they could not make medicine together. I arrested Billy and asked him a few questions in regard to the killing of this beef. I asked him if he had a bill of sale for the beef. He stated that he had. I asked him the name of the party he got the beef from, but he said he could not remember the name, still claiming that he had a bill of sale for the beef. I talked with him until his father was within hearing distance of him, and he called out something to Billy in German, and I told Billy to turn his wagon around, and I took him to town and turned him over to John Bell, telling the latter to hold Billy until I arrested his brother Albert, who was asleep in the butcher shop. As soon as I arrested Albert, he asked where Pa and Billy were. I told him that I had them under arrest too. "Lord have mercy," was all he had to say. I placed the old gentleman in jail, and took Billy and Albert to my camp, and shackled Billy to one of the ranger boys, and Albert to another one, not letting either one of them speak to their father, nor to each other. The case was called for trial in Amarillo, but the defense got a change of venue to Clarendon, Donley County, and Billy was convicted, but got a new trial and finally beat his case. The old man and Albert were also acquitted in their trial at Clarendon. John Veal and Bill Clemens, 2 attorneys from Amarillo, defended them. Mrs. Crump had 3 small children. Judge Clemens and Judge Veal were shrewd enough to borrow 3 more children who lived in Clarendon, keeping the 6 children around Mrs. Crump all the time the trial was going on. In their speeches, the attorneys for the defense would refer to the old lady and her 6 small children, keeping the old lady constantly crying and rubbing her hand over the 6 children's heads. When she and her 6 children would cease crying, Judge Clemens would step over to the woman and tell her that if she didn't keep the children and herself crying, that the old man and the 2 boys would go to the pen as sure as God made little apples. Once the old lady spoke out loud and said that she had already cried so much that she couldn't cry any more if the whole family went to the pen. This caused quite a laugh in the courtroom at the expense of Messrs. Veal and Clemens. Chapter 38. The Capture of Ihart and Spray. While at headquarters camp at Amarillo in 1896, I received a letter from Jim Loving, president of the Cattlemen's Association, asking me to go to San Angelo and out to Big Lake in Tom Green County and look through Major Look and his brother's pasture for burnt cattle. I went to San Angelo at once and hired a wagon and team and got Sheriff Shields and Cattle Inspector Moore to go out to Big Lake with me. I also took 2 Negroes along, one to drive and cook, and the other to rustle the horses. While on my way to Big Lake, which is 105 miles from San Angelo, I drew on my imagination considerably as to the kind of a lake I was going to and the scenery around it. I thought the lake would be full of good, clear water, and that I would see lots of antelope, deer, wildcats, coyote, and lobo wolves going there late in the evening for water. The lake was 1.5 miles long and half a mile wide. We reached the lake at sunset, and our horses were very tired and thirsty, and so were we, but we didn't find a drop of water in that lake, and had to drive until late in the night before we could find water. Early the next morning, we went to Luke's pasture, where we spent the 3 following days rounding up the cattle and looking for burnt brands. We expected to find about 100 burnt cattle, but only found 3. We took them to San Angelo and gave them back to their owners. Then we arrested Major Look and his brother and turned them over to the sheriff, and they were reported to the grand jury. The day after I had arrested the two Look brothers, a man walked up to me on the street and asked me if I was an officer, and I replied that I was. "Do you see that man standing on the sidewalk, about 20 steps from me on my left?" he then asked. I replied that I did. "I want you to arrest him," he said. "What for?" I asked. "He stole a $5 pair of pants from me at the hotel the other night, and he has them on now," he answered. I asked him if he would swear to the pants. "If I could get to examine them, I would," he replied. I arrested the man and took him to the rear of a nearby store, and the man who made the complaint went with us, and after examining the pants he swore that they were his. I then searched my prisoner and found on him a pistol and some letters. Reading one of the letters, which was from his best girl in the nation, I gained some valuable information concerning this man's record. A portion of the letter read this way: "Pet, you have treated your baby bad by stealing those horses and that saddle. The officers are hot on your trail, but my people are trying to make them believe that you are in Kansas and not in Texas. You have gone to a mighty good place to get caught, Pet, and you had better get out of that state or you will be taken in. I am perfectly surprised at you, Pet, for committing that crime, and I don't see how you could have done it if you loved me." I learned that this man was Jack Ihart, a noted highway robber and horse thief. I turned him over to the sheriff, and he notified the officers in the nation, and they immediately came after him, and he was very much wanted up there. Carrying sweethearts' letters got him into a lot of trouble. The following night a man asked me if I wasn't Sullivan, the ranger, and I told him that I was. "My name is Ed Smith. I guess you have heard of me before," he said. "I am an ex-convict, but I have something important to tell you." I told him all right, and he asked me if I wanted a man by the name of Hill Loftus. I told him that I did, and that I wanted him very badly. He asked me if there was a reward out for him, and I told him that there was. Then he told me that if I would give him half the reward, he would point Hill Loftus out to me. I told him that I would do that. He then told me that Hill Loftus was in the back end of a saloon gambling. I went to the hotel, got my handcuffs, and put them in my pocket. Then we went to the saloon, which he claimed Loftus was in. Reaching the front door, I told Smith to go in and see if Loftus was still playing cards. He came back and reported that Loftus was not in there. We then went to every saloon in town, and I sent Smith into all of them to see if he could find Loftus, but he always reported that he failed to find him. Smith then said that Loftus had two aunts living near the depot on the edge of the town, and that he might have gone to their house to go to sleep. So we struck out in that direction to find our man. It occurred to me that Smith might be leading me into a trap, as the house where the two old maids lived was surrounded by timber, and there were no lights in that part of the town, so I kept a close eye on the man who was helping me to find Hill Loftus. After reaching the depot, we inquired at 10 or 12 houses to find out where the two old maid sisters lived, and were beginning to think that we would not succeed in locating the house, when we finally came to a house where the yard was full of pretty shade trees. The front gate was tied at the bottom with wire, so we went around to the back gate and found it also tied so it couldn't be opened. Thinking this place was vacant, we went across the street and aroused a lady who told us that the two old maids lived in the house where the yard was full of trees, which was the place where we had tried to open the gate. I told Ed to go in the house and see if Hill Loftus was there. "If you see him," I said, "you tell him that you have won a big piece of money at a gambling dive, that a big game is going on, and that you are willing to stake him with money, and both go in together and see if you can't win $100. I told Smith that I would hide at the corner of the paled fence, and that I would watch the gate, and when he came out I would join them. I gave him instructions to stop and roll a cigarette when he came out, so that I would have plenty of time to catch up with him. Smith carried out my instructions to the letter. When I came out, I caught up with them and said, "Hello, gentlemen." Both of them spoke very cordially to me. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning. I remarked that I had started downtown to get a drink of beer, and asked them where the nearest saloon was. They pointed one out that was about 40 yards in front of us. I invited them to take a glass of beer with me, and they said they would with pleasure, and we went on toward the saloon. While walking along, I let Hill Loftus get a yard ahead of me, and I eased my six-shooter from the scabbard, holding on the trigger all the time so it would not click when I cocked it. When I got everything in shape, I stepped up to his side and threw my six-shooter cocked in his face and ordered, "Hands up." He at once threw his left hand above his head, but placed his right hand over his heart. "Both hands up," I quickly said, and he immediately put his right hand up. I then pulled my handcuffs out, and, giving them to Ed, I told him to put them on Loftus, which he did. Then I arrested Ed, too, and asked him his name. He said it was Ed Smith. I did not want Ed, but did this to keep Loftus from thinking that Ed had told on him. Turning to the other man, I asked if he wasn't Hill Loftus, and he said he was not, that Jack Spray was his name. He said he was from Greer County. "Have you been passing yourself off as Hill Loftus?" I asked. "No, I have not." I told him that I would hold him anyway, and I carried him over and placed him in jail. I told Ed, in Spray's presence, that I would guard them both. But when daylight came, I turned Ed loose, of course. But I took the other man to Vernon, where I learned that he was wanted in the Indian Territory for horse theft. This man really was not Hill Loftus, but he told Ed that was his name, because he knew of Loftus' bad reputation as a fighter, and he wanted Ed to be afraid of him. Hill Loftus is the man with whom I had such a fight in the dugout in the Comanche Strip, 25 miles from Fort Sill. Chapter 39. A Prize Fight Prevented. While I was stationed at Amarillo in 1896, our entire company and 3 other companies were ordered by Governor Culberson to go to El Paso to keep the Fitzsimmons mare fight from being fought in Texas. We stayed in El Paso 18 days to see that these prize fighters didn't pull off their exhibition in Texas. We also had to put down the tough element of the town, as thieves, robbers, pickpockets, and other classes of criminals were given a great deal of trouble. One night, while City Marshal John Sullivan and I were on duty, we arrested 26 burglars and jailed them, one making his escape. John Sullivan is the man who killed John Wesley Hardin in an El Paso saloon. One night, while in that saloon where Hardin was killed, I met John L. Sullivan and Patty Ryan, prize fighters. While Sullivan and I were trying to rake up a relationship, I noticed that Ryan's nose had been broken, and I asked him what caused it. 14 years ago, he replied, Sullivan and I had a prize fight in Mississippi, and he warped my nose. About that time, I heard a lot of shooting on the street. Sullivan, Ryan, and I were in the back of the building, and about 300 men, the largest portion of whom were full of beer and whiskey, stood between me and the front door. When I heard the shooting, I was satisfied that some of the ranger boys had gotten into trouble with some tough character, and I decided to go to the street as quickly as I could and see what was the matter. I finally pulled through this crowd of men and reached the door, and when I stepped out upon the street, I heard 3 more shots. I located the direction of the shooting from the flash of the pistols, and discovered it was a special ranger trying to arrest an El Paso gambler and a deputy sheriff from Greenville who had fallen out over a game of cards and had come out upon the street to settle their trouble. When the 2 men reached the street, the ranger told them to be quiet or he would arrest them. The gambler got mad and fired at the ranger, and a general shooting scrape followed. Though each man fired several shots, no one was hurt. We arrested the 2 men who had resisted the ranger and took them into the saloon through the back entrance. Much excitement prevailed among the men in the saloon, but after placing the 2 prisoners in the keeping of other officers, I went out the back way and walked around the building to guard the front door, as a crowd of men were trying to break it down and get into the saloon. I had ordered the door shut when the shooting first occurred, because I did not want anybody else to get into the building. There were about 400 men, all tough characters, standing in the street with their 6-shooters out, shining like new money. They tried a number of times to make me let them in, but I held the door shut against them. I knew that most of them were robbers and cutthroats, and that if they got into that crowd of men in the saloon, they would spot out the diamonds and watches and shoot the lights out, and great slaughter and robbery would come off. General W. H. Mabry, our state adjutant general, came to me and told me to put my pistol up. I told him that I could not do it. About that time Eugene Miller, a special ranger, who was helping me to hold the door, yelled at me to look out. I glanced quickly around, and there, standing behind me, was the man who stole Bill Cook away from me in Roswell, New Mexico. I could see the handle of his 6-shooter, which he held in his hand behind him. Recognizing the man in a moment, I turned and asked Miller why he had called me in such an exciting manner. "Everything is all right now," replied Miller, and the man left before anything else was said about the incident. In a few minutes, however, Miller asked me if I knew who that tall man was who stood at my back when he called to me to look out. I told him that I did, that it was the man who stole Bill Cook from me, and with whom I had had some trouble as the result. Miller then told me that the man had his pistol cocked and pointed at my spine, and that when he called out to me, the man threw his hand and pistol behind him. It seems that the man was about to take advantage of the moment, while confusion reigned, and murder me from behind, because of his grudge against me. I told Miller that if I had caught the man pointing his gun at me, I would have killed him on the spot. I can safely say that I saw more tough characters in El Paso at that time than I ever saw before in my life, or ever expect to see again. They were drawn to that town by the prize fight, which was about to be pulled off there. It took 150 officers to preserve order and prevent the prize fight. The fight was pulled off in Old Mexico, about 400 miles down the Rio Grande River. I wanted to go and see the fight, but I was requested by the Adjutant General to remain in El Paso with 11 Rangers and help guard the 3 banks, which I did. Chapter 40. A Bank Robbery. We went to El Paso in November 1896 with 4 companies of Rangers to prevent the prize fight between Fitzsimmons and Mayer. After staying there about 18 days, I started back to headquarters. 2 of my men asked me to let them get off at Bowie for a day, and I consented, after instructing them to come to Amarillo the next day, as we would likely have a great deal of work to do. I continued on my way to Amarillo, and when I reached Wichita Falls, I received a telegram from C. Madsen, the chief marshal at El Reno, IT, to come there and surrender to him as I had a fight in the Comanche Strip. 2 of my boys, Jack Howell and Lee Queen, were on the train with me, and I told them to get off and go to El Reno with me. They requested me, however, to let them go on to headquarters and get some clothes, and they come on to El Reno on the following day. This was agreeable to me, so I spent that night in Wichita Falls, and the boys joined me next day, and we started to El Reno after wiring to the other 2 men who were on the northbound train coming from Bowie to join me. When I arrived at Bellevue, I received a telegram to return to Wichita Falls on the northbound train, as Frank Dorsey, the cashier of the bank at that place, had been killed and 4 men wounded by robbers. My 2 men and I then boarded the northbound train, where I found my other 2 men who had stopped at Bowie. Captain Bill McDonald also was on the northbound train. Mr. J. A. Kemp, the president of the bank that was robbed at Wichita Falls, was on the southbound train, and I told him to return to Wichita Falls with me, as he was needed at his bank. I stepped into the office and asked Anna Nicemore, the operator, to wire the operator at Wichita Falls to have me 6 horses and saddles waiting at the depot when I arrived at Wichita Falls. I asked George Clark, the conductor on the train, to put me in Wichita Falls before schedule time, but I think, from the rate the train ran, we reached Wichita Falls a little ahead of time. Mr. Kemp sat down by me and asked me what the trouble was. I told him that his bank had been robbed, his cashier, Frank Dorsey, had been killed, and 4 other men had been wounded. He turned pale, and tears came into his eyes as he said, "Frank came to me this morning and asked me to let him resign, as he had a presentiment that he was going to get killed, but I talked him out of it." 3 months before Dorsey was killed, I was called to Wichita Falls to guard the 2 banks, as 12 suspicious-looking characters had been seen camping out near town, and the citizens thought they were bank robbers. I took 6 Rangers with me, and we guarded the 2 banks for 3 days and nights. We went out one evening to the place where the men had camped and found pictures of Bill Cook, Jim French, Frank Baldwin, Cherokee Bill, and other noted outlaws, thus confirming the suspicions of the citizens who were uneasy about the banks. While we were guarding the banks on that occasion, Frank Dorsey came to me several times and said that he feared that he would be killed, but I told him there was no danger, as my men could hold out against any robbers. The suspicious characters left the country after we began guarding the banks, and the citizens of Wichita Falls no longer felt uneasy, so we Rangers packed up and went back to Amarillo. 3 months passed away, and everything was quiet and peaceful in Wichita Falls until the dreadful day of the bank robbery, when the cashier, Frank Dorsey, was killed. The night before the robbery, Dorsey told his wife that the presentiment that he would be killed by bank robbers had come back to him stronger than ever. He said that he would resign his position the next morning, that he believed that if he didn't, he would be killed in a short time. His wife told him that it was all imagination, that he ought not to give up his work, as he had a family to support, and the president of the bank thought so much of him. He was easily persuaded by those arguments not to resign, and the next evening his dead body was carried home to a heartbroken wife, and the president of the bank was on the train hurrying back to Wichita Falls, mourning the loss of a fine cashier and valuable friend. When we arrived at Wichita Falls, my horses were standing at the depot, But just as I stepped off the train, 20 or 30 men rushed me into the depot, telling me that the bank had been robbed and Frank Dorsey killed by 2 men, and they could talk of nothing else but the reward, $2,000, which had been offered by the bankers for the capture of the robbers. I told them not to talk to me about rewards, but to give me the descriptions of the 2 men. They did so, and we started out after them. Some of the citizens of the town were already out after the 2 robbers, but after we had gone a short distance, we met most of them coming back to town. Some of them, however, turned and joined us in our pursuit. It was related to us that as the 2 robbers, whose names I learned to be Elmer Lewis and Foster Crawford, started out of town, Frank Hodgester killed Lewis' horse, and he rode behind Crawford until they met a man driving a little dun mare. They relieved this man of his animal, which Elmer rode bareback. They soon met 2 men, who were plowing in the river bottom, and took their 2 large plow horses, releasing the ones they were riding. These 2 plow horses were so large, though, that they didn't last long, and we soon found where the robbers had tied them in a thicket and then waded the Wichita River. Some of the men went a mile below this place and crossed the river on a bridge, and others waded the river where the robbers had, but we saw nothing of them that day, although we were satisfied that they were in some of the thickets in that vicinity. About 8 o'clock that night, we discovered them, after they had come out of a thicket, crossing an open space of prairie to another thicket about 700 yards away. Captain McDonald, Billy McCauley, Jack Harville, Bob McClure, and Lee Queen entered the north side, and I the south side, and we all came upon the robbers about the same time, and demanded their surrender. When we found their 6-shooters on the ground, a few minutes later, we discovered they were cocked, which showed that they came very near fighting us. They had their Winchesters hidden at Wichita Falls, but after they robbed the bank and were leaving town, the citizens prevented the men from getting them. We recovered the money they had taken from the bank, $677.10, and then went to a house close by and got supper, after which we returned to Wichita Falls, arriving there about 4 o'clock in the morning. We guarded the jail the remainder of the night and all the next day, and as everything seemed to be perfectly quiet, and as there were no signs of trouble, we left that evening on the northbound train for our headquarters at Amarillo. When we reached Childress, we received a telegram stating that 2,000 citizens were breaking into the jail. When we reached Clarendon, we received another telegram stating that they had hung the robbers. The citizens of Wichita Falls got $1,200 of the reward, and the other rangers and I received the rest, $800. A few days later, I went back to Wichita Falls, where I met Elmer Lewis's mother. She was standing at the head of the table, watching me while I ate my dinner, and when I had finished, she asked me to come into her room as she wanted to talk with me. After we entered, and she had closed and thumb-bolted the door, she asked me to take a rocking chair. "No, I do not care to sit in a rocker," I answered, "for I had a rib broken not long ago, and it pains me when I sit in a rocker." "I have been wanting to see you ever since I came to Texas," she said. "I am Elmer Lewis's mother. Where were you at the time Elmer was hung?" "I was at Childress." "How far is that from here?" "About 120 miles, I replied, "but I was at Clarendon, 60 miles further up the road, when I received the news that the 2 men were hung." "If you had been here, do you think you could have prevented the hanging?" "I think not, as they were 2,000 strong." "Of course, if that was the case, you could not have prevented it," she replied. "The jailer has my watch, that my son had," she continued, "and I wish you would get it for me." "How old are you, Mrs. Lewis?" "I am 36, she answered. "You are so young-looking that the people here do not believe you are Elmer Lewis's mother." "Well, you see I am Scotch-Irish, and you know we hold our age well." She asked me again about the watch, and I told her that if it was her watch, she should have it. She then asked me to show her the way Lewis and Crawford went after they robbed the bank, and I pointed out the way to her, but never took my eyes off her, for when she bolted the door it made me somewhat suspicious, and when she asked me to have a rocking chair it made me more so, for she knew that if I sat in a rocker I could not get to my pistol easily, and I concluded she had not asked me in her room for any good purpose, as she kept her hands under her apron all the time. She then asked me for my address, thinking, probably, I would lower my head while writing it, but I had an envelope in my pocket which had my address written on it, so I took the letter out and handed her the envelope, watching her all the time. We talked a while longer, and when I arose to leave, I walked backward to the door, keeping my eyes on her while I unlocked it, and then told her goodbye. I believe it was her intention to kill me, as she tried every way to get me to take my eyes off her, but I was on the lookout. The watch, which she spoke of, was advertised in a newspaper, and a man and his wife came from Oklahoma and identified it, telling the jailer it had 3 letters in it and that they were very dim, but could be seen upon close inspection, which proved true. They said the watch had been stolen from them. It did not belong to Mrs. Lewis. I received 2 letters from her after she went back to Missouri in regard to the watch. I learned from the sheriff of her county that she was Elmer Lewis's mother, notwithstanding the fact that she looked so young. Chapter 41. A Call to Hartley. In 1897, while a detachment of us ranger boys were stationed in Hartley, looking after crime, as Hartley at that time was a very tough place, full of thieves and other bad characters, gambling and all kinds of lawlessness going on day and night, I was told that a man, in the back end of a saloon in a private room, was playing cards and putting up United States stamps in the place of money. I went into the room and looked on and saw him lose $6.75 worth of stamps. I asked him if he was a postmaster. He stated that he was. I asked him where he was from. He said, from Coldwater, Texas. I told him that I guess I would have to arrest him, as I was satisfied he was not a postmaster and that he had stolen those stamps. After I had arrested him, he then told me that he was a deputy postmaster, and then I was satisfied that he had robbed that post office of these stamps. I held him in Hartley for a few days, until I could find out from the postmaster of Coldwater if this man was his deputy. The postmaster answered that he was, and that he had robbed the office of these stamps, and for me to be sure and hold him, and he said this man also had a Negro woman for his wife. I wired the United States Marshal at Wichita Falls that I was holding this man for robbing the post office at Coldwater. We had no jail or calaboose in Hartley, so I kept him under guard 3 days and nights. Then I took him to Amarillo and placed him in jail for the nearest marshal to come and get. Before leaving Hartley, I learned that his Negro wife was on a visit in Amarillo, so after reaching Amarillo and placing him in jail, I thought it a good idea to hunt his Negro wife. There were only 6 or 8 Negroes living in Amarillo. I located the house in which she was stopping, and found that 3 men and 3 Negro women were stopping at this place. I knocked on the door, and someone inside told me to come in. I went in and asked, "Which one of you women is Mrs. Joe Jackson?" A yellow Negro woman answered and said, "I am Mrs. Joe Jackson." Then I told her that I had come from Coldwater, and had met her husband, Mr. Joe Jackson. "But when I left Coldwater," I continued, "your husband told me to hunt you up, saying that he was very sick at Coldwater." She said she was very sorry, and that she was glad I had informed her, and that she would take the first train for Coldwater. I then told her that her husband had told me the county they had married in. She told me that it was in Burleson County, Texas. I told her that I liked her husband very much, and that I thought he was a nice gentleman. She stated that he was very good and kind to her. I told her that he had told me who married them in Burleson County, but I had forgotten. She said old Squire Blackburn had married them. She also stated he had 2 brothers, and also had 2 sisters, and that his father was dead, that his brothers, sisters, and mother disliked it so much for him to marry her that they left at once for Coldwater, and had been there ever since they had married. After getting the information from her that they were legally married, I then arrested her and placed her in jail where I had placed her husband about 1 hour and a half before. When I got the jailer up, about 1 or 2 o'clock in the night, he opened the door and she spoke. Her husband recognized her voice from his cell and asked, "Is that you, Annie?" And she answered, "It is." And then she asked, "Is that you, Joe?" And he answered that it was. "This officer has got me arrested," she replied, "and told me he met you in Coldwater, and that you were very sick, and stated for me to hurry home, and he got me to make a statement about us being married, and after making my statement he arrested me." That gave the state a case, as it was a violation of the law for a white man and a Negro woman to marry in Texas. Chapter 42. On the Trail of Train Robbers. While in Amarillo, I was notified, in 1899, by the Adjutant General, that a train was robbed at Benbrook, 14 miles from Fort Worth, on the T&P Railroad. J.V. Good, superintendent of the Fort Worth and Denver, had a car sent for our horse and saddles. After loading the horses and saddles on, we crawled into the caboose, and the car was hitched onto the southbound passenger train, and we arrived in Fort Worth on schedule time. Sheriff Eulis of Tarrant County joined us at Fort Worth, and Superintendent Thorne of the T&P Railroad had our car hitched to an engine, and we left immediately for Weatherford. Everything between Fort Worth and Weatherford was sidetracked, and, having an open track all the way, we made a quick run, arriving at our destination that evening. We unloaded our horses and saddles, and spent the night in Weatherford. The following morning we were joined by the sheriff of Parker County, and all of us started out together to look for the robbers. At Springtown, the sheriff of Tarrant County had to leave and go back to Fort Worth. We searched the whole country around Weatherford, finally striking the trail of 2 men who were well armed, each having 2 belts of cartridges, a Winchester, and 6-shooter. One of the men was mounted on an iron gray stallion, while the other was mounted on a black, bald-faced, stocking-leg horse. We followed the trail of these 2 men and struck the Fort Worth and Denver road at the town of Sunset. While crossing the country near Red River, I lost the trail, but I learned that a Joe Couch had loaned an iron gray horse to a stranger about 2 weeks before the robbery and had never seen it since. I looked for Couch, but failed to find him. I decided that the robbers were playing fox on us and had turned back, so we dropped back, too, going to Decatur, and tried there to get all the information that we could concerning the fugitives. While I was in Decatur, I had occasion to call up Irby Duncan in Fort Worth on a little business, and Colonel R.D. Hunter, president of the T&P Coal Company, got the other end of the line for a few minutes, and asked me how I was getting along with the train robbers. I told him that I had lost their trail, and it did not look like I was going to find it again. He asked me if I had been notified that the Rock Island had been held up and robbed the night before. I told him that I had not, so he notified S.B. Hoovey, superintendent of the Rock Island, that I was in Decatur with 6 Rangers. I asked Colonel Hunter to have Captain McDonald, who was in Fort Worth at the time, found and brought to the phone. McDonald gave me a little more information about the Rock Island holdup, and I quit the trail of the Benbrook robbers at once, and went to work on this other case. I went to Bridgeport, reaching there in a few minutes, and found transportation, which Superintendent Hoovey had sent me. A little later on, Hoovey came up to Bridgeport from Fort Worth on the train that was to pull us to Red River. Hoovey and I discussed the situation at some length. Before leaving Bridgeport, I found Joe Couch, the one who loaned one of the Benbrook robbers a gray horse. I found him playing cards, and I took him and his horse with me on the train to Red River. Reaching Red River, I learned that the robbers had boarded the train on the Texas side, and while the train was crossing the river, they relieved the passengers of all their money and jewelry. Arriving in the little town of Harrell, on the other side of the river, we discovered that the officers of that community had captured the robbers and placed them in the depot, where they were kept under guard. We put the prisoners and the officers, who had them in charge, on our train and took them to Duncan. The marshal of that town claimed the men, but they were given over to the Texas authorities, and we put them in jail in the town of Montague in Texas. They were tried twice, and succeeded in beating their cases. I was on hand at the trial, and we encountered lots of toughs who were in town to intimidate the court and get their friends clear. I was satisfied that these men were the same men who had held up the train at Benbrook, and I told the others that. I received a letter from Sheriff Pat Weir of Cook County that there was an iron gray stallion in the livery stable at Gainesville, so I went at once to that town and had the sheriff point the horse out to me. I also asked the sheriff if he knew the man's whereabouts, and he said he thought he was across the river in the Indian Territory. I learned before I left headquarters camp a second time that this gray stallion belonged to a man at Henrietta. Pat Weir and I went across the river to look for this man who had stolen the gray stallion, and about 7 miles on the other side we learned that there was a suspicious-looking stranger picking cotton at a certain farm. We went at once to this place, and going into the field, we saw a cluster of men all picking cotton. I had never seen the man before, but ever since I had been on his trail the first time, I had had him described to me so often that I knew him before Pat and I had gotten close to him. Pat also knew the man from the description I had given of him. He surrendered to us, without any trouble on our part, and we asked him, in the presence of several witnesses all around him, if he was willing to go across the line without any requisition. He said that he was, so we handcuffed him, and, hiring a horse, we left with him at once for Gainesville. When he neared the river, he remarked that he believed that he would not cross the line without a requisition. We told him that we would show him whether he would cross over or not, as he had said before 15 or 20 witnesses that he would go into Texas with us without requisition. He then went on to Gainesville with us without any further trouble. We gave him a bed in the Gainesville jail that night, and took him the next morning to Henrietta, where we notified the owner of the gray horse that he could get his property. Our prisoner was wanted for selling mortgaged mules, as well as for stealing this horse. The Benbrook train robbers, whom we came so near capturing several times, were finally caught in Fort Worth by local officers. End chapters 36 to 42.